Hello, and welcome to Bat Gaze, a podcast about evil and complicated queer people in history. I'm Ben Miller, a writer and historian, currently at work on a book about the fashion designer Rudy Gernrich.
And my name's Hugh Lemmy. I'm a writer and author.
Great. Last week, we talked about Reed Erickson, who was a extremely wealthy trans guy who funded the standards of medical care for trans people and also research into dolphin ESP. Who are we talking about this week, Hugh?
Well, today's subject is the Crown Prince of Iraq, Abd Al-Ilah, who rules the country as a Prince Regent on behalf of his nephew from 1939 to 1953, although not interrupted, as we will discover.
So he was a gunkel.
He was a gunkel. Born in Taif, a city now in Saudi Arabia, but then in the Vilayet of Hejaz in 1913, he was the eldest son of Ali bin Hussein, the king of Hejaz, himself the eldest son of the very influential Hussein bin Ali of the Hashemite dynasty, an important power broker in the fractured Middle East of the post-Ottoman era, and a key figure in early pan-Arab politics.
Are the Hashemites still the dynasty in control of Jordan?
They are,
Okay.
which we will get onto. But I do think, we should start with some backstory into the dynasty, some context for how this young man who might have expected his own throne ended up becoming the power behind another throne, that of the king of Iraq. The story is complicated, as you might expect, but it goes some way to explain the sort of twists and turns of his life and how and why he made the fatal political alliances that he did. So let's go back to the state of play when he was born in 1913. The Ottoman Empire at that point stretched from in the north, modern-day Istanbul, then Constantinople, all the way across the Middle East to the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula in the south, a sort of long finger that goes down the coast, and then to Mosul in Iraq in the east. It encapsulated much of the modern-day sort of Middle Eastern states of today. So the cities of Mecca, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Aleppo, Mosul, and Medina were all under its control. A very expansive empire. But it had been in a very long internal decline and has entered World War I on the side of the Central Powers. And after some early successes in the Middle East, its control over the region really started to break down. And so in 1916, Arabs led by the Hashemite family rose up in the Hejaz region in the Great Arab Revolt, which we talked about in some depth in the Lawrence of Arabia episode. But just to recap briefly, this was an uprising that was supported by the British against the Ottoman Empire that pushed up against all the odds, first to Aqaba on the edge of the Sinai Desert, and then finally all the way up to Damascus in modern-day Syria, where its leader, Hussein bin Ali, who was Abd Al-Ilah's grandfather, declared a new nation, the Arab Kingdom of Syria, with his son Faisal as the king. The British, as part of their negotiations to bring the Arabs into the war against the Ottomans, had promised to recognize the creation of a pan-Arab state after the war, a new nation that crossed the Middle East, where they're victorious.
And we know the British Empire never lied.
Well, yeah, because unbeknownst to the Arabs, however, they had also made a secret deal with the French, a treaty that, following an Arab victory, they would both partition up the Middle East between themselves, with France receiving modern-day Syria, Lebanon, and Kurdistan, and part of Turkey, and Britain receiving Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan, more or less.
And this has led to no problems since then.
Yeah, they drew lots of straight lines on the maps, and I think we can agree they did a bang-up job.
Great work all around.
So in 1917, the British also informed Zionist organizations in Britain that this plan would also include a national home for Jews in Palestine. And so within these regions, there would be areas that would be under direct British and French control, and there would also be areas that were under so-called British or French influence. So with the war over, the British obviously kept their deal with their European neighbours, the French, and not with the Arabs who actually lived there. And so the Middle East was partitioned according to this treaty that's known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And these were administered under international law as mandates under the League of Nations, which had just been formed. These were areas that were controlled by imperial powers with various rights supposedly recognised and protected for minority groups and ethnicities. So the former Ottoman territories were what were known as Class A mandates, meaning they were regarded as essentially more civilized and developed enough to allow for the creation, under the aegis of the Western powers, of new, supposedly independent countries. So these regions were now Greater Lebanon and Syria, which were under the French mandate, and the Emirate of the Transjordan, mandatory Palestine, and mandatory Iraq under the British mandate. The system didn't allow, of course, for the pan-Arab nation which Hussein had imagined and been promised, nor even for the Arab kingdom of Syria, which was formed after the war by Faisal, with Faisal as a king. So King Faisal recognized that a war that was about to emerge between the French, who wished to impose their mandate on the territory, that would be completely brutal for the Arabs who lived there. So when they invaded, he surrendered. In Iraq, meanwhile, the British were struggling to deal with the sort of internal divisions following this thing called the Great Iraqi Revolt of 1920, which was a revolt against mandatory rule. So what Iraq needed, they thought, was its own king. And so they gave it Faisal, who had left Syria. So Faisal ruled the country under the British mandate with British military bases on the ground until 1932, when it finally became theoretically an actually independent nation.
Surely no imperial power would ever in the future think that it would be easy to control Iraq and decide to basically slaughter as many people necessary to achieve that far-off dream.
I mean, this is the tragedy of the region, which is the continual intervention of the West.
And destabilization.
And destabilization for its own interests, of course.
Right.
And they chose Faisal, particularly because they regarded him as probably the best candidate to enable a stable, peaceful nation which would be under British influence.
And one of the reasons why everyone wants influence over this region at the time is oil, right? World War I has just been fought. It's this horrible mechanized slaughter, but mechanized slaughter and this new thing called an Air Force, all of this requires gas. All of this is fossil fueled. And oil is going to be the fuel of the future, and this is the place where all of it is. And so all of a sudden, this is a place that every imperial power wants to make sure that it has its piece of in order to get resources that it needs to fight future wars.
Right. And it's the RAF, the British Royal Air Force, that is the sort of governing power in de facto at the time.
Right.
The sort of attempt, as happened at post-invasion 2003, was this very difficult task of so-called nation building. There had been no Iraq under the Ottomans. It wasn't a nation. There was no...
It truly is unbelievable how much I remember being a kid and watching on the news people talk about the task of nation building in Iraq. George W. Bush, like 100 years later, or 80 years later, 70 years later. There were people alive then and were alive, and it's astonishing.
Yeah, and
not astonishing. It's an accurate reflection of the thick-headedness of imperial power and how these imperial logics will just continue and continue and continue, even when they don't actually bring benefits anymore to the imperial metropolis.
Right. And because there'd been no Iraqi nation under the Ottomans, there was little to no meaningful sense at this point of a cohesive Iraqi national identity in that way. And so Faisal's pan-Arabism was seen as a way to maybe start that process, because it was hoped that he would unite the Shiite majority with the Sunni minority, of which he was part, into a sort of shared Arab-Iraqi identity. However, the Ottoman Empire had been Sunni, and thus the Shia who were living in what was now Iraq had suffered a lot economically and socially by the Ottoman rule. And what's more, the idea of a pan-Arab identity would then further divide the population, because it would divide the majority Arab population from the minority Kurdish population, who also hadn't received their own recognized state in this great carve-up of the post-war period.
Right. The Kurds had also been lied to and promised a state by Western powers, no?
Right, yes. So Faisal was just one member of this Hashemite dynasty that had gained influence after the Great Arab Revolt. They claimed direct descendancy from Fatima, who was the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad, and through him to his grandfather, Hashim ibn Abd Manaf, who was where Hashemite comes from. For almost 1,000 years, they were the rulers of Mecca, but it was Faisal's father, Hussein bin Ali, who founded the modern dynasty. So while Faisal was to be the ruler of Iraq, Hussein's eldest son became the king of Hejaz and the Sharif of Mecca, and so he inherited his father's titles after his father abdicated. And the son in between, Abdullah, became the king of Jordan, and indeed, as you mentioned before, his great-grandson is still now the king of Jordan. But let's go back to his eldest son, Ali bin Hussein, the king of Hejaz. He came to the throne after his father, who had been fighting and losing a war against the House of Saud, abdicated his responsibilities.
The House of Saud that now rules the country known as Saudi Arabia.
Exactly. So he'd been losing this war, so he abdicated the throne and his son became the king, but this didn't really help. Within a year, sort of in the winter of 1925, the House of Saud had pushed the Hashemite rulers out of Hejaz, with Ibn Saud then ruling both kingdoms until he then united it into what is now Saudi Arabia 6 years later. And the Hashemite family had fled to the kingdom that had been ruled by his brother Faisal, Iraq. And in the entourage was his eldest son, our boy himself, Abd Al-Ilah. So that's how the heir to the throne of Hijaz ended up living in Iraq. In September of 1933 in Iraq, Faisal I died. His son, Ghazi, became king. And the following year, he married Abd al-Ilah's eldest sister, so his first cousin, Elia, who had fled with her brother and parents at the same time. Ghazi was a very different king to his father. Where Faisal was cautious, Ghazi was quite reckless. Although both were pan-Arab nationalists in their ambitions for a Hashemite-ruled Arab state or federation, Faisal very much dressed in the traditional Arab clothing, while Ghazi, who was educated in England, preferred Western-style suits and fast cars. As a teenager, he actually took a joyride in a plane over Iraq with the very charismatic bohemian adventurer and bad gay. We should do an episode on him at some point in the future. Richard Halliburton, in his plane, the Flying Carpet, during Halliburton's round-the-world plane journey. But
wait, Halliburton is in Halliburton that Dick Cheney worked for?
Different Halliburton, different Iraqi adventurer Halliburton.
Aye.
So while Faisal would maintain his family's alliance with the British quite tightly, Ghazi was suspected, especially as his reign continued, of harbouring increasingly sort of pro-German sentiments. He actually ran his own radio station in one of his palaces, which the British, of course, monitored to hear his opinions. And he talked a lot in that with his sort of theories about how he wanted to expand Iraq by invading Kuwait. Fancy that. And also these sort of increasingly anti-British remarks, these pro-German remarks. He began this process of modernizing agriculture and the economy. He was publicly quite popular, but he never really tackled the sort of sclerotic political class that dominated the cabinets of the country since the First World War. And they were riven by sectarian infighting and very petty ambition. And so as a result, there was this younger reformist generation who were pushing up, wanting to shake up this old civil government. And so in 1936, General Bakr Siddiqui led a military coup, replacing the administration with his own regime. This was the first military coup in the modern history of the Arab world, in fact, the first of many in Iraq. And it would be the end of the sort of constitutional, even if it was corrupt, government of Iraq. Ghazi backed the coup, so remained king, but within 10 months, Siddiqui had been assassinated, and then his old rival, the former Prime Minister, Nouri al-Said, returned. Al-Said comes up a lot. He's a consistent figure in mid-century Iraqi politics. He served as Prime Minister no less than 8 times. And really, it's his politicking with Western powers and oil interests and his own people that would lead to this growing discontent and political fractiousness in Iraq that would end the Hashemite rule in the end. Ghazi, as I mentioned, was something of a playboy. Ghazi and Aliyah had a son in 1935 who he named Faisal, after his father, and the British, who were increasingly suspicious of the independent moves that Ghazi had made and were plotting against him, introduced spies into his court, of course, who reported on his homosexual dalliances, especially with his servants. One of his servants actually died of a gunshot wound in a hunting accident, or alleged hunting accident, but the British ambassador, in a memo to Whitehall, wasn't so sure about this, and he wrote, quote, "The tarnished personal reputation of King Ghazi has, I regret to say, been besmirched further in the course of the last few days. On or about the 18th of June, a Negro youth, employed as a personal servant to His Majesty, was found shot within the palace precincts. According to the official story, death was due to the accidental discharge of the young man's revolver. It seems far more likely the young man was murdered, either because he'd become a source of embarrassment to the king or by some adherent of the Queen, Aliyah, who regarded the youth with a deep aversion as the king's boon companion in debauchery."
Boon companion in debauchery is a wonderful title.
Is the new partner.
It is. It's the new heroic fighter for self-responsibility.
That sense of debauchery lingered over the court, especially when the king's elder sister eloped to Greece and converted to Christianity to marry a Greek man. So in 1939, Ghazi was driving his car at high speed through Baghdad when he lost control of it and hit a telegraph pole, which fell and split his head in two.
Yeah.
The official ruling was that it was an accident, but the historian Hannah Batatu comments that suspicion immediately fell on the Prime Minister, Nouri, who felt that Ghazi was a disruptive force, or on the Queen, Aliyah, and her brother, Abd Al-Ilah, who, she'd long lived a sort of separate life from her man-chasing husband, or even, of course, on the British, who were increasingly worried about his saber rattling that he was making towards Kuwait. Batati writes that the allegations, quote, do not add up to anything conclusive, but neither do they dissipate the doubts that still surround the incident. The lurking suspicion of having masterminded or played roles as accessories to outside influences in the king's death pursued Nuri, Abd Al-Ilah, which is how he's also known, and Queen Aliyah to the end of their lives, end quote. He also notes that the documents relating to this issue are mysteriously missing from the British government archives.
Oh my goodness, what a strange coincidence.
That's a very common mishap.
Similar notes, can you believe that the CCTV footage from the prison on the evening that Jeffrey Epstein died, they just can't find it? Isn't that amazing?
In his diaries, his friend in England, the Tory MP and very bad gay Henry Chips Channon, wrote, quote, King Ghazi of Iraq was killed by a motor car. He is unlucky with motoring, since his chauffeur gave him the clap only recently. So with Ghazi dead, his son, who was just 4 years old, was crowned Faisal II. His uncle, Aliyah's brother and our bad gay, Abd Al-Ilah, was appointed as his regent to rule in his name and interests until he reached the age of majority, with Aliyah's guiding hand presumably pretty close to the wheel as well. Abd al-Ilah's regency couldn't really have begun at a worse time. It was the autumn of 1939, World War II had begun, and Iraq was sitting on this huge resource that would be vitally necessary to both the Axis and Allied war machines, the oil.
Right.
Abd al-Ilah steered a very steady ship in terms of alliances, bringing Iraq into a much closer relationship again with the Allies. In April 1941, however, a group of discontented nationalist army officers led by Rashid Ali al-Gilaini, they launched a coup. They saw the Axis forces as a potential ally in winning a more complete independence from British control, in much the same way as Roger Casement in the First World War saw the Germans as a way that the Irish could win independence as well.
Right.
Hitler supported this. He issued a Führer command. They sent weapons and planes, some troops and other material support to the coup, which was also supported by the Vichy forces, the Vichy French forces in Syria. Faisal II remained the king, but of course the regent and Nuri fled. They took refuge on a British warship. Are you ready for a disturbingly English name, Ben?
I'm always ready for a distinctly English name, Hugh.
The warship was the HMS Cockchafer.
The HMS what, Hugh?
Cockchafer.
The HMS, what was that again?
Cockchafer.
Cockchafer.
I am English through birth on both sides, going back God knows how long. I have no idea what a cockchafer could be other than something that chafes a cock.
I have many ideas about what it could be, but I didn't think they named warships after them. This is like the tweet from the wonderful philosopher Olufemi Taiwo that says when you realize that the British Empire really did plunder a quarter of the land's wealth and resources in order to build a transit system that includes a Piccadilly line train that goes to Cockfuckers.
I mean, maybe I'm mispronouncing it, and maybe it's one of those things like Coburn. Like it might be co-chauffeur, but it's spelt.
Oh yes, of course, darling. Of the Kent co-chauffeurs.
Yeah, exactly. But it is written and spelled the HMS Cockchafer.
The HMS Cockchafer. Well, that's what I'm naming my boat when I buy one with all the money we make from the bad gays' money, I think. Isn't that what should name our yacht, Hugh? Keep donating on Patreon because then we can buy a yacht. No, just kidding. We do not have yacht money. Please do donate.
So using the HMS co-chauffeur, as we'll call it now.
No, let's call it the Cockchafer. Continue.
Britain invaded using Indian Army troops.
You're saying they invaded the Cockchafer?
No, the Cockchafer invaded Iraq. And
they just chafed its cock until they...
Enough Cockchafer. So using the HMS Cockchafer...
You say enough Cockchafer, then you keep saying Cockchafer.
So using the HMS Cockchafer...
I'll refrain from making any more jokes.
Yeah. Britain invaded, and in a short Anglo-Iraqi war, they defeated the new regime. They returned Abd al-Ilah to the regency, and they occupied the country. So as you can imagine, this only strengthened the bond between the regency and the British. Abd al-Ilah had long been an Anglophile. He'd moved in the same English circles as King Ghazi had. He was friends with Chips Channon, and also another Tory MP, bad gay, Alan Lennox Boyd. Both were exceptionally fond of him, and they regarded him as an extremely cultured and well-mannered man, something that especially appealed to Lennox Boyd's racist, imperial ideas of Britain as being a civilizing influence in the region.
Is he, an exceptionally cultured and well-mannered man?
He
In other words, a cockchafer.
is a cockchafer. So in his diary, which I'm going to read a few excerpts from because I think it gives a really good insight into the sort of relationship between the English and the regime at the time and the attitudes that were sort of circulating. Chips Cannon, writes about how he and Alan Lennox Boyd hosted a dinner party for the Regent. Quote, soon after they'd all assembled, the royal party came in 2 huge cars. Alan and I were on the doorstep in the mist. Out stepped the slim, uniformed figure of the Regent, followed by a 2 large suite. I ushered them in and introduced them all round. Circe Londonderry did not curtsy. Patsy LB, acting as hostess, looked very beautiful, but she did not help. At 9 o'clock, after cocktails, and I noticed that these Arabs did drink, we processed into dinner. The blue dining room was en fête. This was a stupendous achievement in the 5th year of a war. The food was adequate and the drink flowed, so did the conversation. The Regent was obviously impressed. When the ladies left, I sat with him over the port. He is a mild-mannered little man, gentle, unassuming, and curiously enough reminds me of another Regent, my blonde Paul. He has been overworked with seeing too many factories and aeroplanes, and thoroughly enjoyed an evening out. It was his last, as tomorrow the party returned to Baghdad. There were undercurrents. All went well. The Emir warmed up, lost his shyness, and I had one of my great successes with him, certainly. One conversation had a double entendre, and we chatted of cigarette cases, jewels, and Rolls Royces. Then we joined the ladies, or rather didn't, as the exquisite Emir evidently preferred the gentlemen, and never once spoke to the glittering female assembly of beauties. He also asked me to visit him, and said to come now. Next time he came to England, he would ring me up from the station. He was fascinated by my bibelots, boxes, and jewels, and fingered them. Ought I to have given him one? His manner is highly flirtatious and insinuating. He is a frivolous flaneur, and doesn't seem in the least Arab. He often dreams of the Prophet. Now, he said, he would dream of me. End quote. So you get a taste for the sort of circles that he's moving in and friends he was making.
God.
So Chip's...
Is it possible to give your brain a shower? Just wondering.
Chip's relationship with the Regent continued. In another entry, he would write, quote, about 10:30 p.m., the Regent of Iraq, who I like more and more, arrived. We are very intimate. I never can resist a Regent.
The question is if he can risk a cockchafer.
And another entry, quote, the food was delicious and the house looked splendid. Gold plate, red wine, an atmosphere of elegance. The Regent bought me a coffee set of solid silver, 6 cups and a huge salver, and a coffee pot with a spout like a pelican's.
Can you believe the ugly coffee set he brought me?
Well,
Is there a gayer complaint than this guy flirting with gave me a silver coffee set? It was ugly.
it was hideous.
It was hideous.
Well, it can't have been too hideous because the next morning's diary entry begins with the Regent leaving.
Well, was it hideous or did it work?
Actually, I'll show you now a photo of him taken by Cecil Beaton because
Did he, have his photograph taken by Cecil Beaton?
he did, of course, in Baghdad, as in the same photo series as photos of the young King Faisal as well, who was very cute in his little tailored suit. But this is Abd Al-Ilah, and maybe you can describe what you're seeing.
Wow. Well, it's a very striking gaze. Yeah, it's a slender man. There's a high forehead. He's got a kind of receding hairline and a little trimmed mustache. Very angular eyebrows, a very snazzy peak lapel, double-breasted suit. And his left hand arm is crossed over his right, and he is doing what I can only describe as the universal hand gesture of faggotry, with this sort of limp wrist.
Over his crossed legs.
And his crossed legs, yes. Is a very gay picture.
It's a very gay picture. He's an extremely elegant man, clearly.
Very, very elegant. But it's like, he looks like a kind of gay villain in a Hitchcock movie. He looks like the people in Rope.
He's to my taste, I think he's quite cute.
He's very cute.
But you can tell by the way he is dressed that he's someone who's very attuned with, the latest in contemporary fashions. He's very Western oriented.
Yes.
For 6 years following the Anglo-Iraqi War, the British occupied Iraq. They left in 47, 48, that sort of time. And when they left, it was a very different country to how it had been at the start of the monarchy under Faisal I. There was a growing urban population, a growing strong middle class, and there were new political currents, especially the Iraqi Communist Party, which was gaining in popularity for lots of reasons, one of which, of course, is that it largely avoided the sectarianism that divided the country. With Nouri, once again the Prime Minister, the Regency took on a dual strategy to dealing with this. They increased modernization and urbanization using money from these new oil deals that they were brokering with the West, who were very pleased that it had such a strong ally in the war. And at the same time, they were repressing internal dissent very harshly, including very harsh crackdowns on communists, and also sort of taking advantage of anti-Semitism and furthering these anti-Semitic discourses. Jewish people had long been used by the regime as a scapegoat. And in 1948, there was this event called the Adas Affair, where Shafiq Adas, who was a Syrian-born Iraqi Jewish car importer, was tried for both aiding the Zionist enemy in Israel through money exporting cars, maybe weapons, that was what the accusation was, and he was also accused of being a communist. Both being a Zionist and a communist were illegal at this point. It was also an attempt to ingratiate Abd Al-Ilah and Nouri and the regime with the population by scapegoating Jews and communists as eternal enemies or enemies within in the aftermath of the Nakba and also of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But Adas wasn't a Zionist. He was a loyal Iraqi Jew by all accounts. And the trial was really a kangaroo court. There was no witnesses at the trial, he wasn't allowed a defense, and there was no real concrete evidence against him. But nonetheless, he was found guilty and he was hanged in the street. And then following his public execution, the government purged thousands of loyal Iraqi Jews from government roles, and they also confiscated Adas's considerable assets. And in the aftermath of the Adas affair, there was an exodus of Iraqi Jews to various places. In 1955, Iraq then became a founding member of the Baghdad Pact, which was a military alliance between Britain, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Turkey, who were all ruled by British-aligned regimes at that point, hoping to produce a sort of military bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East. These pro-British policies were increasingly counter to a pan-Arab mood that was in the Iraqi public sphere at the time and in the Middle East in general. They could really be contrasted, especially with the policies of President Nasser in Egypt. Nasser was a pan-Arab nationalist and a modernizing socialist force who seemed to kind of be giving two fingers to the former colonial powers, not least to, of course, when he nationalized the Suez Canal, leading to the Suez Crisis. So popular opinion in Iraq was very firmly with Nasser, and that further degraded the public opinion about Nouri and Abdullah and the Faisal rule, because they were seen as not following this strong stance against the former colonial occupiers. And things then reached a crisis when, under Nasser, Egypt and Syria united into one country, the United Arab Republic, which was an attempt to move towards a pan-Arab republic in general, but also as an attempt to neuter increased communist presence in Syria. That's why one of the reasons the Syrians were interested in entering the United Arab Republic.
Right, Nasser is complicated because he's kind of, on the one hand, a developmentalist socialist, and on the other hand, responsible for putting down a lot of communist organizing.
Absolutely, yeah, under a nationalist, a pan-Arab ideology.
Right.
By this point, Faisal was now ruling in his own name. He'd reached the age of majority, but Abd Al-Ilah was still very much on the scene. In response to this, Iraq formed its own new federation, the Hashemite Arab Federation, with its neighbor Jordan, which was ruled over by his cousin Hussein, and that acted as a counterpower, theoretically, to the United Arab Republic under Nasser. It was not quite as strong it wasn't really a federation, it was more a confederation. You can see what they're trying to do here in terms of building a Hashemite monarchical counterbalance within the Middle East to the Republican United Arab Republic.
Right. Republican if authoritarian under Nasser's very personalized control.
Right. Within the Arab Federation, internal dissent was very high. Nouri attempted to buy back the officer class that he had failed. There was like this new upsurge of pan-Arab nationalism within the officer class. He tried to sort of pay him off, but it didn't really work. although he might not have realized at the time that it wasn't working. And relations with the United Arab Republic had surpassed frosty. And in 1958, the United Arab Republic moved troops to Jordan's Syrian border. So the government then ordered troops to be moved from Iraq to Jordan to counter this threat.
Ooh.
But the units had to move through Baghdad. And so they had a good excuse to be in the city. If you have, in general, sort of an unruly officer class and a threat to your government,
And keep them from massing in the capital.
keeping troops out of the capital is a good idea, but they were passing through the capital as a transit point, and which, of course, was the perfect moment for the army to launch a coup. And on the 14th of July, the coup, which is now known as the 14th of July Revolution, was launched. Brigadier Abdul-Karim Qasim took control. Faisal abdicated, and a new Iraqi republic was declared. But his abdication wouldn't save them. The king, his former regent, Abd Al-Ilah, and the regent's wife and his mother, because he had been married actually 3 times, they were taken into the courtyard of the palace and shot. Their bodies were horrifically mutilated, and Abd al-Ilah's corpse was actually hung from the palace balconies. In the looting of the palace, his intimate letters to Alan Lennox Boyd were found and published. Further proof in the eye of the officer class of the sort of dissolute and treacherous life that being a friend to the English had brought to the Iraqi court.
Hi, you're listening to Bad Gays. We're an audience-supported show. We don't have a network, we don't have sponsors or advertising. It's really you guys who keep the show on the road. So if you're interested in supporting us, why not head over to Patreon, where you can listen to Extra Bad Gays, our monthly podcast about all things queer.
It's really fun to do. You get to hear from us every month. You get to hear from us in a less scripted format. We're starting to do fun new things like an advice column segment. Again, all of that is only for subscribers. You can also subscribe on Apple Podcasts right there in the app. We also have new merch for Season 8. We have t-shirts, we have socks that say Evil Twink Energy on them. We have caps in pink and camo and black. Go check it out, all at our website at badgayspod.com. All of that helps us keep the show going and do more of this, which we love to do.
And now, on with the show.
Thanks for that story, Hugh. So my first question is, so we leave Iraq here in the late 50s, just after this coup. Is this coup the government that ends up with Saddam Hussein, and then we're familiar with the history from there, or what happens between?
No, there's a series of military coups. So Qasim stays in power until the Ramadan Revolution, which is in 1963, and then there were more coups. There was in 66, there was another coup, and then finally in 1968, there was the coup that resulted in the Ba'ath Party, which is Saddam Hussein's party in power. But Saddam Hussein was then the vice president. What's interesting is actually Saddam Hussein becomes the president because in the late 1970s, there's a move by the Ba'ath Party in Iraq to join with the Ba'ath Party in Syria to try and bring the two countries back into another union, this time between Syria and Iraq, as a new form of pan-Arab nationalism. And Saddam Hussein, who is not the president of Iraq, actually makes a move to consolidate his power at that point, specifically because he realizes that in a Ba'athist pan-Arab union, he would lose the power that he's already got in Iraq. So Saddam Hussein comes to power specifically to as a pan-Arabist, specifically on the back of a campaign to stop having a pan-Arab Ba'athist state.
That's fascinating. The next thing I wanted to ask you about was this question of Orientalism. There's all this writing about debauchery, right? The word debauchery comes up in all these Englishmen writing about this court. Do we think that these stories are maybe some of the stories about Al-Ilah and his relationships with English men? I mean, nothing would be more explosive maybe to a post-colonial nationalist masculinity, an idea that our regent might have been being literally penetrated by the foreign other, right? Is there reason to think that any of this might have been exaggerated? I mean, he did have wives, or do we think that the tales of his homosexual behavior were actually true and then just exploited by these different people or used by these different people?
First of all, I think he's true. There's clearly evidence in people's private diaries of his lovers, for example. So, like that seems to be pretty firm evidence. I actually don't think it was massively exploited. There is this sort of story about these letters being found after his death, but the homosexuality, if Ghazi was also engaged in the same thing and he had that support, it questions the idea of whether there really was like a huge sort of feeling of debauchery and dissolution that was part of that opposition. It seems more likely that this is just an addition, a little thing you add on, but really what's going on here is real politics, let's say, like,
right.
People trying to grab power and et cetera, et cetera. One thing is actually quite interesting that comes up in some of the discourses that we've talked about actually in our episode of Bad Gays Extra is around how homosexuality was perceived in the post-colonial moment, and especially in Iraq, in Jordan, and in Palestine. And in the post-colonial moment, as the penal codes, the colonial penal codes, were taken off the books, homosexuality and sodomy was not made a crime again in some of these states. So actually, for example, in the West Bank, which was at that point part of Jordan, there was no anti-sodomy legislation, which suggests that a sort of anti-sodomy moral panic around the influence of the West was not part of the discourse.
Right, but it was seen as part of the general potentially disillusion of the...
Yeah, it's sort of an internal narrative, of course, that you would press if you had these rich rulers who seemed out of touch. Then obviously
Right,
homosexuality goes along with the Western suits and the fast cars.
And they're foreign, and they're, yeah. I want to get back to this, also to this idea of these various kinds of alliance, right? You talk about an Iraqi officer class at one point allying with Nazi Germany against its colonial rulers. There are various alliances with the Soviet Union that get made later on. And to get back to this topic that we've been dancing around, I mean, Bad Gaze is not a show that thinks that Palestinian self-determination is anti-Semitic, nor is it a show that thinks it's anti-Semitic to critique what are now, I think, pretty clearly genocidal actions on part of the current Israeli government. And it's not just me that thinks that, it's also every relevant humanitarian organization and the International Court of Justice. But to get back to the question, one of the things that happens sometimes when you talk about this is that people in bad faith will show you a picture of a mid-century or sort of 30s Arab leader with a German official, as if to say, see, look, they were all cooking up this grand plan to eliminate all of the Jews with Hitler, and they were all part of this, as they say, eliminationist anti-Semitism. You do, of course, mention the use of anti-Semitism by the Iraqi rulers, as anti-Semitism has been used by many Western rulers. Presently, Viktor Orban, who's a dear friend of Netanyahu's son Yair, to kind of paint certain people as being out-of-touch elites and to kind of build popular support for elitist political projects, right? It's not for no reason that it's called the socialism of fools. To what extent do you think that these kinds of alliances were driven by actual alliance with the political force in question? Or should we just understand them as almost attempts to strike out against the dominating colonizer, who in this case was Britain, in any way possible, right? Like, if it's Germany, they'll do Germany. If it's the Soviet Union, they say the Soviet Union. Like whoever it is that might provide a counterweight to this Britain into Iraq evolving Anglo Empire that really does not give Iraq a single moment's peace or a chance to develop from its artificial creation all the way through till multiple wars and invasions.
In this particular instance, I don't think there's any real ideological reason why they're joining with the Nazis. I think it is a purely strategic reason. Mm-hmm. The Second World War, I guess, is someone else's war that they're caught up in to some extent. And both these powers are trying to exploit the region in that situation where you feel like that's the way it's going to impact you. Then, of course, those are the terms in which you're going to ally. I think if the tables had been turned, I think either party could have made alliances with either party.
Yeah, makes sense. So if people want to learn more about this, what are some of the sources that you used to research this episode?
There's a bunch of different sources that I used, some to put together the sort of history of the Hashemite dynasty and some to deal specifically with the lad himself. There's A History of the Middle East, Shifting Lines in the Sand, Kuwait's Elusive Frontier with Iraq by David H. Finnie. The Twilight of the British Empire, British Intelligence and Counter-Subversion in the Middle East by Jakara Hashimoto. And then more specifically, Iraq and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the 20th century by Juan. The Adas Affair, which is an article in Tablet magazine by Adi Schwartz. Closet Queens by Michael Bloch. And Henry Chips Cannon's Diaries, 1943-1957, edited by Simon Heffer. There's also a very interesting interview with Morris Draper. Morris Draper was serving as a political and economic officer of the Baghdad Pact Secretariat at the time of the revolution. And that's on the website of the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training.
Great. So, Abd Al-Ilah, good gay, bad gay, good, not gay, bad, not gay?
Bad, gay or bisexual. I mean, the accounts of him from Chips Cannon seem to suggest that he wasn't that interested in women. But I definitely bad the sort of manipulation and use of anti-Semitism and anti-communism at the time, throwing this poor guy on trial is bad.
And I think in this episode we've come up with a new term for bad gay. Cockchafer. Certified cockchafer.
He is a certified cockchafer.
So that's our show. I'm Ben Miller, and you can find me anywhere on the internet by typing in Ben Writes Things, and you'll find me there.
I'm Hugh Lemmy. You can find me online at hugh.substack.com.
And until next week, bye now.
Bye.
Bad. 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 Bad gays. Bad gays. Bad gays. Bad. 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 Bad.